Tulsi Gabbard is one of the more exciting Democratic candidates for the 2020 presidential election. She's young, dynamic, and overall unconventional, which is something voters still seem to desire following the last general election. Tulsi's a veteran who toured Iraq twice and is a harsh critic of the wars that push for regime change. And also in 2016, she endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders and took a principled stance against the Democratic National Committee by actually stepping down as the vice chair.
I am resigning from the DNC so that I can support Bernie Sanders for president. I'd like to tell you why. As a veteran and as a soldier, I've seen firsthand the true cost of war. I served in a medical unit during my first deployment, where every single day I saw firsthand the very high human cost of that war. I see it in my friends who now, a decade after we've come home, are still struggling to get out of a black hole. I think it's most important for us as we look at our choices as to who our next commander-in-chief will be is to recognize the necessity to have a commander-in-chief who has foresight, who exercises good judgment, who looks beyond the consequences, who looks at the consequences of the actions that they are looking to take before they take those actions, so that we don't continue to find ourselves in these failures that have resulted in chaos in the Middle East and so much loss of life.
Tulsi's principled stance during the 2016 election was strong and admirable, to say the least. And all of a sudden, she went from having little name recognition on a national scale to grabbing the attention of many left-wing voters who were hungry for sincerity and authenticity. Now, in an effort to be upfront about my own biases, I have to tell you that when Tulsi announced that she was going to run for office, I was extremely excited. But in my initial view, she represented everything I liked about Bernie Sanders and possibly more. The fact that she's young, a woman, and a veteran is extremely appealing because I felt that she would have valuable perspectives on issues that Sanders might be weaker on. But soon after her announcement, a few issues came up that I think are worth exploring. This is not a takedown or a hit piece on Tulsi. I still think she's a fascinating candidate. I still think she has several attributes that place her above many of the other Democrats running. But it would be misleading and unfair to my audience if I pretended there weren't some concerns for progressives. Most of the worries I personally have center on Tulsi's foreign policy views. While she's clear in her disdain for military intervention in the name of regime change, she is supportive of the war against terror. The Intercept reports that Tulsi has argued in support of the global war on terror, a position antithetical to her anti-war image. The website votetulsi.com includes a direct quote by the Congresswoman that reads, "In short, when it comes to the war against terrorists, I'm a hawk. When it comes to counterproductive wars on regime change, I'm a dove." While that might sound okay on the surface, think about how many interventions the US has found itself in since the Bush administration, all in the name of fighting terrorism, right? So I'm not just talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm talking about major military operations in Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, right? These were all done in the name of fighting terror. There have also been US-led coalition airstrikes in Mali, Syria, Libya, and West African airstrikes in Nigeria. Have those military actions ended global terrorism? Of course not. We originally invaded Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban. Now we find ourselves negotiating with them as part of the US exit strategy. According to Brookings, the Taliban promises Afghanistan's territory will not be used by international terrorist groups, and the United States agrees to withdraw its forces. Also, the so-called war on terror has been cited to push for regime change, which is what we saw in Libya. While I do acknowledge that Tulsi has been critical of US military involvement in Libya, I worry that her self-proclaimed hawkishness toward the war on terror is an indication that she is supportive of some of the same counterproductive foreign policy that's made a mess of international relations. Tulsi's hawkishness toward terror has led her to support military actions I, along with many other progressives, disagree with. Torture tactics like waterboarding, which were given the euphemism of enhanced interrogations, was something that Tulsi was supportive of.
Soldier, how do you respond to the much discussed report on the CIA's use of torture and what some Americans have called a blot on American values? Do you share that opinion, or as a soldier do you have a very different perspective on the use of torture?
Very bluntly, I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted on this report. There are, I think the jury is still out on the report itself. There have been comments that there are things missing or it was incomplete, and there are differing opinions on the report itself. But as I think about it myself, clearly we would not like to see any human, any person around the world being treated inhumanely. On the other side, I can also understand that any of us, if we're in a situation where our family or our community, our state or our country is in a place where, let's say in an hour, a nuclear bomb or an attack will go off unless this information is found. I believe that if I were the president of the United States, that I would do everything in my power to keep the American people safe.
But even in a scenario that Gabbard outlined in that answer, we know that the report by the Senate Select Intelligence Committee in 2014 found that methods of torture utilized by our CIA broke international war crime laws and did not result in credible intel. The report's conclusions found that the use of the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of obtaining accurate information or gaining detainee cooperation. The interrogations of CIA detainees were brutal and far worse than the CIA represented to policymakers and others. It also found that 39 detainees were subject to enhanced interrogation techniques, which included sleep deprivation, waterboarding, prolonged standing, and exposure to cold. At least 26 detainees were found to be held wrongfully. At least 5 detainees were subject to rectal rehydration. At least 3 detainees were waterboarded. 1 detainee died in custody, possibly due to hypothermia. Look, the report was so damaging and damning that even CIA Director John Brennan confessed to how wrong the agency was for using these techniques.
Agency officers used interrogation techniques that had not been authorized, were abhorrent, and rightly should be repudiated by all. And we fell short when it came to holding some officers accountable for their mistakes.
Tulsi's self-proclaimed hawkishness also explains her support for drone use. To be clear, I am not supportive of drone strikes, and I've been highly critical of how the Obama administration carried out their use. I believe drones have exacerbated hostilities toward the United States by killing innocent civilians, which in turn helps terrorist organizations recruit and radicalize individuals. In fact, in my view, I should say, Bernie Sanders' support for drone strikes happens to be one of his flaws. In fact, here he is showing his support for drones on Meet the Press in October of 2015.
What does counterterrorism look like in a Sanders administration? Drones, special forces, or what does it look like?
Well, all of that and more.
You're okay with the drone?
Look,
using
drone is a weapon. When it works badly, it is terrible and it is counterproductive. When you blow up a facility or a building which kills women and children,
sure.
You know what? It not only doesn't do us, it's terrible.
But you're comfortable with the idea of using drones if you think you've isolated an important terrorist?
Yes.
So.
Look, I'm a Sanders supporter. I haven't made my decision about who I'm going to vote for in the Democratic primaries yet, but I have to admit, I hated that answer because these perfect little scenarios where the military isolates the enemy and only kills that person rarely exist. The intelligence used to carry out drone strikes has been unreliable and faulty to say the least. And I don't wish to support the same tired and counterproductive policies Obama and now Trump supported. Unfortunately, Tulsi Gabbard also seems to support the use of drones. The Intercept reports that when asked if she still favors a small footprint approach with limited use of weaponized drones against groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Gabbard said, quote, "With these terror cells, for example, yes, I still believe that the right approach to take is these quick strike forces, surgical strikes in and out very quickly, no long-term deployment, no long-term occupation, to get rid of the threat that exists and then get out, and the very limited use of drones in those situations where our military is not able to get in without creating an unacceptable level of risk." Again, the intel behind these strikes is oftentimes faulty, and innocent lives lost as a result do little to improve national or international security. I have more on that later in this segment. In reality, Tulsi's hawkishness is actually pretty well documented. Here she is on Fox News in 2016 following a Republican primary debate, arguing that the Republican candidates weren't proposing policies that were harsh enough against Islamic extremism.
Are the candidates talking on either side enough about these issues to your liking?
No. They're not, and they're not being held accountable for their positions on these issues of national security, on these issues of how to defeat not just ISIS, but Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and a number of the other Islamic extremist groups that do pose a threat to the American people and the United States.
Well, they say that it's the administration's fault for not being more diligent. Do you hear anything out of the Republican candidates that sounds more aggressive?
I listened to some of the debate that we had just last night, and I had an early wake up, but
okay.
I listened to the part relating to national security and foreign policy, and was disappointed to see that there was a lot of strong talk against ISIS, but the reality on the ground in Syria today is that if ISIS is defeated, you have Al-Qaeda affiliated group Jabhat al-Nusra that is poised to take over all of Syria and create this emirate or caliphate there that would be a hub for Al-Qaeda.
In other words, another morphed terror group, right?
Exactly.
And
that's the key here, Neil, is that people talk about ISIS, but you're not talking about the ideology, the radical Islamist ideology that's fueling ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and a whole variety of other ones.
Ted Cruz says you bomb until the sand glows.
Well, I want to say why I think that there's not enough focus being put on these Islamic extremist groups with the current policy, which I think is important to recognize, and that is because the current policy is the United States is working with so-called allies like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and other states to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad and are aiding and supporting directly many of these Islamic extremist groups in doing that.
Now, I agree with Tulsi in how destructive it is to work with Saudi Arabia. We've talked about that on the Young Turks show quite a bit. But her emphasis on identifying and fighting radical extremism is what makes unsavory figures like Steve Bannon love her. She seems to believe that it's solely the religion or ideology of the terrorists that lead to terroristic acts that we see today. While the ideology of extremism certainly does play a significant role, Tulsi never acknowledges how US foreign policy helps bad actors in radicalizing others. If we're using drone strikes that kill innocent civilians abroad, that encourages and persuades their living family members to join terrorist organizations in fighting the West. Tulsi's ideology toward Muslims actually aligns quite a bit with the right wing. In 2014, she introduced a bill that would have halted the visa waiver program for allied countries whose citizens had gone to fight with extremists. Tulsi claimed that the waiver program, quote, puts the American people in danger. Look, it didn't pass, but had it passed, people from the UK, France, Germany, and many other European countries would have been forced to apply for visas before visiting the United States. Tulsi was also extremely critical of Obama's refusal to use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, which was a common criticism coming from the right wing.
What difference would it make if he used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism or extremism?
Look, this is something that I've disagreed with the president on because I think it's important that you identify your enemy, you know who they are, you call them by their name, and you understand the ideology that's driving them. You know, I understand and appreciate the president's concern, which is he doesn't want all Muslims to be cast with the same targeting or the same look as this handful of radical jihadists. And I agree with that. No one wants that to happen. But that's why I think it's important that we make this distinction.
As I mentioned earlier, Tulsi's policies and rhetoric toward Muslims caught Steve Bannon's attention. And soon after Trump was elected, she was invited to meet with the president-elect for a possible role within his administration. According to a source who spoke to The Hill, Bannon loves Tulsi Gabbard, loves her, wants to work with her on everything. She would fit perfectly, too, inside the administration. She gets the foreign policy stuff, the Islamic terrorism stuff. Bannon appreciates Gabbard's willingness to publicly criticize President Obama for refusing to name the enemy, radical Islamic terrorism. NBC News reports that Trump asked for the meeting, Gabbard says, to discuss Syria, the fight to defeat ISIS and al-Qaeda, and other foreign policy issues. Tulsi also said, while the rules of political expediency would say I should have refused to meet with the president-elect, I never have and never will play politics with American and Syrian lives. Okay, that's fine. So let's take a moment to talk about the Syrian lives she says she cares about so much. If you can recall, back in 2015, there was a giant debate raging about whether or not the United States should accept Syrian refugees. These are civilians who were desperately fleeing a war-torn country in search for safety. Tulsi actually voted for a GOP-backed bill to make it virtually impossible for Syrian and Iraqi refugees to come to the United States. Remember, this was before Trump came into power and ordered the Muslim ban. Tulsi was one of 47 Democrats to join the House GOP in passing the SAFE Act, which would have added extra requirements to the already thorough refugee vetting process. It would effectively halt the admission of Syrian and Iraqi refugees into the country. There were other foreign policy issues Tulsi agreed with Republicans on. While she has been critical of how Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, she was actually a vociferous critic of the deal back in 2015, saying at the time, quote, "We cannot afford to make the same mistake with Iran that was made with North Korea." In other words, she wouldn't have approached the Iran nuclear deal from the framework of diplomacy. Also, keep in mind that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was highly critical of the deal and continuously pushed for US-backed escalation toward Iran. When he delivered his unprecedented speech to Congress in March of 2015 to criticize and end the deal, Gabbard refused to join Democrats who boycotted that speech, and she really attended it herself. She has been honored by right-wing pro-Israel forces at the World Values Network Gala, which was co-hosted by influential Republican donor Sheldon Adelson. A photo from the event shows Gabbard posing with avid Trump supporters Rabbi Shmuley and Miriam Adelson, the wife of Sheldon. Now, keep in mind though, Miriam Adelson is the type of person who's been very vicious against Palestinians and even considers them a made-up people. There are also worries about her affinity for strong men like President al-Sisi in Egypt, who Tulsi says has, quote, shown great courage and leadership in taking on the extreme Islamist ideology while also fighting against ISIS military to keep them from gaining a foothold in Egypt. But look, as I mentioned earlier, the war on terror is not so cut and dry. It leads to unintended consequences and innocent lives lost. The US has been selling al-Sisi weapons to help in the US battle against extremism. In 2015, Egyptian forces bombed a convoy of Mexican tourists about 5 times over a period of 3 hours, even after local security forces on the ground had stopped them twice and cleared their passage. 8 Mexican tourists were killed in the mistaken attack, which shows you that the intelligence is often imperfect or inaccurate. That's a huge part of the reason why I'm against drone strikes. While these foreign policy concerns are legitimate, I want to end this segment by noting that there are some great progressive policies that Tulsi supports. She's a fighter for Medicare for all, supports a $15 minimum wage, and understands the severity and urgency of climate change. Her camp has been in touch with TYT to schedule a possible interview, and I look forward to chatting with her about the issues I raised in this segment. It's important to have an honest conversation about all the candidates so we can make the right decisions. Valid critique is an important part of the process, and I hope that everyone understands that.